What would you do if the person you were forced to marry turned out to be the greatest surprise of your entire life?
Hold that thought, because this story is about to prove that the moment you think you know exactly how something is going to go, life has already made very different plans for you. Our story begins in Wisconsin, and right away, you need to understand something. Not all golden cages look like prisons. Some of them look like mahogany dining tables, leather-bound bookshelves, and manicured lawns that stretch so far you forget the rest of the world even exists. That was Max Aldridge's life. From the outside, it was flawless. A luxury apartment downtown, a chauffeured commute, a family name that opened doors before you even knocked. Max had been groomed for greatness since before he could spell the word. Every grade tracked, every achievement rewarded, every stumble quietly noted and corrected. He was the golden son of a family that treated success like a religion and expectations like scripture. But here's the thing about a life built entirely for someone else's vision. It tends to hollow you out from the inside. And Max, standing at that wide picture window one evening, watching the sun drop behind perfectly trimmed hedges, felt every inch of that hollow. He was 26 years old, and he had never once made a decision that was entirely his own. He was about to be asked to make the biggest one of his life. His parents arrived home that night the way they always did, composed, deliberate, dressed for an occasion that hadn't started yet. His mother, Elaine, moved through the room like a chess piece with intentions. His father, Charles, said very little, because Charles never needed many words to change the temperature of a room. They sat. There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long. And then Charles slid a folder across the table like it was a perfectly ordinary thing to do. It was not an ordinary thing. Inside that folder was a marriage contract, a bride already selected, a deadline already set. The terms were simple and brutal: marry the woman his parents had chosen, or forfeit the inheritance he had spent his entire life being groomed to receive. No discussion, no negotiation, no time to process the fact that his future had apparently already been decided in a room he was never invited into. Max's jaw tightened. He thought about love, real love, the kind you choose freely, the kind that starts with a glance across a room and builds into something neither person planned. He thought about how every instinct in his body was screaming that this was wrong. And then he looked at his mother's eyes, hard and unwavering, and his father's expression, patient in the way that powerful men are patient when they already know the outcome. And Max understood something cold and clarifying. This was not a conversation. It was a notification. He picked up the pen. He signed. And just like that, somewhere across the city of Milwaukee, in a kitchen filled with the smell of fried chicken and collard greens, with gospel music drifting from a radio on, the counter and the sound of a family gathered around a big oak table, a young woman named Helen Johnson had absolutely no idea that her life was also shifting into motion. Helen was 17, brilliant, and rooted in something Max had never had, a sense of belonging so deep it didn't need to be explained or performed. She was the pride of her family, top of her class at Lincoln High, dreaming of becoming a music teacher someday. Her father, Gregory, had built a small insurance agency from the ground up, and every Sunday he reminded Helen that no amount of success meant anything if you forgot where you came from. Her mother, Marcia, was warmth made human. And in Milwaukee's thriving black community, Helen had grown up surrounded by people who understood that strength wasn't something you acquired, it was something you inherited and carried forward. When her mother mentioned that a proposal was coming, a match arranged through mutual connections, Helen didn't panic. She didn't shut down. She listened, and she thought, and she held the uncertainty with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from knowing exactly who you are. Her community had always taught her that love and respect mattered more than appearance, more than assumption, more than the fear of the unknown. She was nervous. But she was open. Two people, two completely different worlds, one arrangement that neither of them asked for. Max spent the hours after signing that contract building a story in his head, and it was not a kind one. He told himself she would be plain, uninteresting, someone chosen for strategy rather than compatibility, someone he would have to endure rather than enjoy. He had never met her. He had never seen her face. But he had already decided exactly who she was going to be. and the rehearsal dinner was only 1 day away. Here is the question I want you to sit with right now before we go any further, because it matters more than you might think. How many times in your own life have you already decided how something was going to disappoint you before you ever gave it a single chance to surprise you? Think about that, because Max Aldridge is about to walk into a room, and nothing, not one single thing he has prepared himself for, is going to be what he expected. Now, before we go any further, I need you to picture something for me. Picture a man standing in front of a mirror, straightening his tie for the 4th time in 10 minutes. Not because the tie is crooked, but because his hands won't stop moving. Because stillness right now feels like surrender, and if he keeps adjusting, keeps smoothing, keeps doing something, anything, then maybe he won't have to sit with the truth that is pressing against the inside of his chest like a fist trying to break through. That man is Max Aldridge, and tonight is the rehearsal dinner. He hadn't slept well. Of course he hadn't. How do you sleep soundly the night after you sign your life away to a stranger? How do you close your eyes and drift peacefully into rest when somewhere across the city a woman you have never met is preparing to walk into a room and become, by arrangement, by contract, by your parents' careful design, your future wife? You don't. You lie on your back in a luxury apartment that suddenly feels very small, staring at a ceiling that gives you no answers, and you let your imagination do the worst possible thing it can do in a moment like that. You let it run, and Max's imagination had been running all night long. It had constructed an entire person out of nothing, out of fear and assumption, and the particular kind of dread that comes from having no control over something enormous. He had pictured someone plain, someone chosen for practicality rather than personality, someone his parents had selected the way you select a business partner, by spreadsheet, by strategy, by what made sense on paper rather than what made the heart move. He told himself it didn't matter what she looked like. He told himself he would be civil, cordial, professional even. He would fulfill the obligation, protect the inheritance, and find a way to build a bearable life inside the arrangement his parents had constructed around him. That was the plan. That was the story he had written for himself, somewhere between midnight and dawn. But here is what Max did not account for. Life is a far better writer than any of us. He arrived at the banquet hall early. Of course he did. Max was always early, always controlled, always the first one to scope the room so he could decide in advance where to stand and how to look and what expression to wear when the moment came. The hall was beautiful in that studied, corporate way his family preferred. Chandeliers that threw soft gold light across white linen tablecloths, centerpieces of ivory roses and eucalyptus, round tables arranged with the precision of people who understood that even seating charts were a form of power. Catering staff moved silently along the edges of the room. A string quartet played something low and elegant in the far corner. Everything was exactly as it should be, and Max felt absolutely nothing. He felt like a man attending his own trial. He found a marble pillar near the entrance and stationed himself against it, drink in hand, club soda, because tonight of all nights he needed to be sharp, and he watched the room fill up around him. Business associates of his father's, family friends who smiled at him with the particular warmth of people who already knew something he was only just learning. His mother Elaine moved through the crowd like she had choreographed every step, greeting guests with a smile that Max recognized as her public face, the one she wore like armor, beautiful and impenetrable. His father Charles stood near the bar, deep in quiet conversation with one of his lawyers, and Max noticed that Charles had not looked at him since they arrived. That detail unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, because Charles Aldridge always looked at Max. He watched him the way generals watch their officers, constantly assessing, measuring. The fact that he wasn't watching now meant one of two things. Either this evening was entirely beneath Charles's concern, or it mattered so much that Charles couldn't afford to show it. And Max had known his father long enough to know it was never the first thing. So he stood at that pillar. And he waited. And every time the main doors shifted or a new voice entered the room, his eyes snapped toward the entrance with a speed that had nothing to do with indifference, and everything to do with a man who is desperately, privately terrified of the next 60 seconds of his life. Ask yourself something right now, and I mean really ask yourself, not just skim past the question, Have you ever waited for something that you were convinced would disappoint you, but some quiet, stubborn part of you was still hoping, still watching the door, still holding on to the thinnest thread of possibility? Because that is exactly where Max Aldridge was standing, against that marble pillar, with his club soda, pretending he didn't care. He cared enormously. The string quartet shifted to something softer. The room's chatter dropped a half note, the way sound changes when a crowd senses something is about to happen without being told. Max noticed it. He noticed the way heads began to turn toward the main entrance. He noticed the maitre d' straighten his jacket and move toward the center of the room with the particular purpose of a man about to make an announcement. And Max noticed, with a sensation he could not have named in that moment, that his grip on his glass had tightened. The maitre d' cleared his throat. The room quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the bride, Miss Helen Johnson." The doors opened, and Max Aldridge's entire carefully constructed world came apart at the seams. She walked in the way that certain people enter rooms, not with performance, not with the self-conscious awareness of being watched, but with a kind of natural, unhurried grace that made the room feel like it had been waiting for her without knowing it. Helen Johnson was tall, radiant, and so completely at ease in her own skin that everyone around her seemed to unconsciously straighten up, as if her presence had quietly raised the standard of the room. Her hair was swept up with a few soft curls falling loose around her face, and she wore an ivory dress, simple, elegant, chosen clearly by someone who understood that the right outfit never competes with the person wearing it. It frames them, and the dress framed Helen the way a gallery wall frames a masterpiece. She carried a small bouquet of white roses, her own choice, the florist would later say. She had picked them out herself that morning, which told you everything you needed to know about Helen Johnson in about 4 seconds. She was someone who knew her own mind, and she was not afraid to use it. Max did not move. He genuinely could not. Every rehearsed expression, every prepared piece of body language, every carefully assembled wall of polite indifference, gone, dissolved completely, like paper in rain. He stood at that marble pillar, and he stared. And he was not even aware that he was staring because every conscious faculty he possessed had temporarily abandoned its post to deal with one overwhelming, undeniable fact. This woman was not what he expected, not even close, not even in the same universe as what he expected. She was extraordinary. And here, right here, is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because what happened next was not planned by anyone in that room. It was not engineered by Charles or Elaine or by any of the careful arrangement of logistics that had brought these two people to the same hall on the same evening. What happened next was older than contracts, and older than strategy, and older than every calculated move the Aldridge family had ever made. Helen's eyes found Max's across the room, not gradually, not after scanning the crowd, directly, immediately, as if she had known exactly where to look. As if something underneath the noise and the chandeliers and the small talk had simply pointed her to him and said, "There." Their eyes met, and the room, all of it, the quartet, the guests, the crystal glasses and ivory tablecloths, and the decades of family expectation pressing down from every direction, all of it blurred, softened, fell away. Time did something strange. It slowed, the way time only slows in moments that matter. In moments your memory will return to for years afterward, running it back, looking for the exact instant when everything changed. This was that instant. This was the frame. And both of them felt it simultaneously, which is the most terrifying and wonderful thing that can happen between two people who have only just laid eyes on each other. Max exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Beside him, he heard his mother make a quiet sound. Not a word, not quite a gasp, but the kind of involuntary noise that escapes a person when reality refuses to behave according to their plan. Elaine had expected something manageable, something she could organize around. She had not expected this. She had not expected a young woman who walked into a room and immediately owned it without trying to. And the fact that Helen was beautiful, genuinely, undeniably stop what you are doing beautiful, had rearranged something in Elaine's expression that she was not yet ready to examine. Charles, for his part, had gone very still, and a very still Charles Aldridge was a man recalculating. But Max wasn't watching his parents. Max was watching Helen make her way across the room, unhurried, gracious, pausing to smile at a family friend, bending briefly to accept a hug from an older woman near the entrance. And he was doing something he almost never did. He was feeling something he hadn't planned to feel. She reached him. She stopped. Up close, she was even more present. That is the only word for it. Not louder, not more dramatic, but more there, more real. Her eyes, he noticed now, were a warm hazel, steady and direct in the way of someone who has been taught that confidence is not arrogance. It is simply the knowledge of your own worth. She looked at him the way you look at a person when you have decided, in advance, to be fair to them, to see them clearly before you judge them, to give the moment a real chance. She extended her hand. "Hi. I'm Helen." And just like that, with 4 words and an open hand, the entire architecture of Max's assumptions collapsed completely. He took her hand. He felt the gentle, firm warmth of her grip, and he said, "I'm Max." And then, because honesty has a way of surfacing in moments of shock, he added, "It's really nice to meet you in person." The words came out slightly breathless, slightly off his usual cadence, and he was aware of it and did not care, which was itself remarkable, because Max Aldridge always cared about his cadence. Helen held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to let him know she had heard something true in those words, and then she smiled. Not the polished smile she had offered the room, a different one, smaller, quieter, private almost. "You too," she said. And that was it. That was the beginning. Not the contract, not the signatures, not the carefully managed rehearsal dinner, or the families watching from their corners of the room like generals observing the opening movement of a campaign. No. The beginning was those 4 seconds. That handshake. That quiet, private smile. Everything else was just furniture. Now, I want you to stay with me here, because this is the part of the story where most people assume it becomes simple. Boy meets girl, assumptions shattered, love at first sight, curtain falls. But that is not what happened. What happened was far more complicated, far more human, and far more worth your attention, because the room they were standing in was still full of people with agendas, and the world outside that room had not changed simply because something beautiful had started inside it. But for the next 2 hours, Max and Helen were entirely unaware of any of that. They were seated together at a round table near the center of the room, and from the moment they sat down, the conversation moved the way conversations only move between people who are genuinely, instinctively interested in each other, not in the careful, self-conscious way of a first date or the performative way of people trying to impress, but in the easy, almost surprised way of 2 people who keep discovering that the other one is more interesting than they expected, and cannot quite stop reaching for the next thing to say. Helen started it. So, arranged marriage, fun or terrifying? She asked it with a lightness that was also perfectly serious, which is a very specific skill, and Max laughed, a real laugh, not the managed chuckle he deployed at society dinners, and the last of his tension broke apart like ice at the end of winter. "Terrifying," he said, without hesitation. "Absolutely terrifying. But," he stopped himself, looked at her, made a decision. "But walking into this room tonight and seeing you, I was prepared for the worst, and instead I got the best surprise I've had in years." He said it before he could edit it, and the honesty of it sat between them like something solid, something real. Helen looked at him for a moment. Then, "I'm glad," she said softly. And there was no performance in it, no strategy, just 2 words from someone who meant them. They talked. They talked the way people talk when they forget they're supposed to be nervous. They discovered, almost by accident, that they both loved old jazz records, not the sanitized dinner party jazz that played on radio stations for people who wanted jazz in the background without actually listening to it, but the real thing. Miles Davis at his most searching, Coltrane at his most restless, Billie Holiday at her most heartbreakingly honest. Helen told him she had grown up listening to her father's record collection on Sunday mornings after church, lying on the living room floor with her eyes closed, learning to hear the space between the notes. Max told her he had a stack of vinyl in his apartment that his business school friends thought was absurd. Helen laughed at that, a full, warm, unguarded laugh, and said, their loss. They talked about food. Helen confessed that her favorite thing at the buffet was the macaroni and cheese, which had surprised her because she had expected banquet hall food to be the usual disappointment. Technically competent, emotionally empty. But someone in that kitchen had made it right. My grandmother would approve, she said, which was the highest compliment in Helen Johnson's vocabulary. Max told her he had eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants on 3 continents and had once had a meal in Paris that cost more than some people's monthly rent, and that he would trade all of it for a proper home-cooked Sunday dinner. Helen studied him when he said that. Really studied him, the way you study a sentence when you are trying to decide if it means what it appears to mean. "I think you actually believe that," she said. "I absolutely do," Max replied. She nodded slowly. "Good answer." They talked about cheesy 80s movies, which led to a 5-minute argument about whether The Breakfast Club or Ferris Bueller was the defining film of the decade. And the argument never resolved because neither of them was willing to concede, and neither of them really wanted to stop arguing because the arguing was too enjoyable. Max showed her a photo on his phone of his Labrador, a golden-colored, perpetually enthusiastic dog named Duke, mid-leap in what appeared to be an attempt to catch a frisbee the size of his own head. Helen's face when she saw that photo, the way it softened immediately, involuntarily, the way faces do around animals before the brain has a chance to stay composed, told Max something important about her, something the contract hadn't mentioned, something a spreadsheet could never have captured. She had a heart that opened quickly, and she wasn't afraid of it. And now, right now, I need you to pause and sit with attention underneath all of this. Because here is what the table conversation looked like from across the room. 2 young people laughing, talking easily, leaning slightly toward each other, the way people lean when they don't want to miss a word. Warm, natural, almost inevitable. Here is what it looked like from Elaine Aldridge's perspective. A threat. This was not the quiet, manageable arrangement Elaine had constructed in her mind. She had envisioned a marriage that would be orderly, practical, a union that would serve the family's interests and remain, emotionally speaking, at a temperature she could control. What she was watching right now was not that. What she was watching was her son, her carefully managed, strategically groomed son, laughing freely for the first time in longer than she could remember, in the presence of a woman Elaine had not fully anticipated. Helen's beauty was one thing. Beauty could be managed, categorized, filed away. But that ease, that genuine, unperformable ease between them, that was something else entirely. That was a variable Elaine had not planned for. She picked up her wine glass and took a long, slow sip. Across the room, Charles Aldridge watched his son with an expression that his colleagues would not have recognized, because it was not the expression Charles wore in boardrooms or at contract signings. It was softer than that, more complicated. He watched Max lean toward Helen to hear something she was saying, watched Max's face shift with genuine delight at whatever she had said, and something moved in Charles's chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Something that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with a memory of himself, decades younger, leaning toward a woman at a party and feeling, for the first time in his carefully planned life, like the future was something to look forward to rather than manage. He looked away, and said nothing, and kept recalculating. On Helen's side of the equation, her father Gregory Johnson had arrived at the dinner with the particular alertness of a man who has built everything he has with his own hands and has learned, through experience and disappointment and hard-won wisdom, that the world does not always wish his family well. Gregory was not cynical, but he was careful. He had agreed to this arrangement because the people who brought it to him had earned his trust over years, and because Helen had looked at him with those clear, steady eyes and said, "Daddy, let me see it first before we say no to anything." And Gregory, who had raised Helen to trust her own instincts, had honored that. But trust and vigilance are not mutually exclusive, and Gregory Johnson spent the first hour of that rehearsal dinner watching Max Aldridge the way a man watches someone handling something irreplaceable, looking not for the grand gesture, but for the small ones. The way Max listened when Helen spoke, whether his eyes moved around the room when she was talking or stayed on her face, whether he laughed with her or at her, whether there was respect in the details, and slowly, almost against his will, Gregory saw what he was looking for. Max listened. Max stayed, Max's eyes didn't wander, and when Helen made a point he disagreed with her directly, clearly without condescension, which meant he respected her enough not to pretend. Gregory recognized that. He had spent 40 years being that kind of man for Marcia, and he knew what it looked like from a distance. He still wasn't ready to relax, but the fist in his chest had loosened 1 degree. Now, here is where the story shifts again. Because what happened next was not part of anyone's program for the evening. It was not on the printed schedule, or the catering timeline, or the event coordinator's clipboard. It happened because Max made a decision, a small one, quiet, almost imperceptible, and small decisions in big moments have a way of changing everything. During a lull in the dinner, between the appetizers and the main course, in that 15-minute window when people drift and reform into new conversational clusters, Max stood up from the table, looked at Helen, and said simply, "Come with me for a minute." Not an instruction, not a request either exactly. Something in between, the way you speak to someone when you've already decided they are the kind of person you can be direct with, and you are testing, gently, whether you are right. Helen looked at him for a half-second. Then she stood up. They walked together through the side door of the banquet hall and out onto a balcony that overlooked the city. Milwaukee at night spread out before them in a canvas of amber streetlights and illuminated windows, the distant sound of traffic rising like a low, indistinct song. The air was cooler out here, carrying the faint, sweet scent of something blooming, night jasmine, planted in the building's window boxes, invisible in the dark but absolutely present. Helen put her hands on the railing and looked out at the city, and Max stood beside her, close enough that he was aware of the small distance between them, as if it had mass, as if it were a thing with weight. He needed to say something. He had known it since the moment she walked through those doors, and rearranged everything he thought he understood about this evening. He had been carrying it through 2 hours of conversation and jazz records and Labrador photos and macaroni and cheese debates, and it had been building the whole time, quietly, steadily, the way water builds behind a dam, not dramatically, not explosively, just with the patient, inevitable pressure of something true that needs to be said. He turned toward her. "Helen, I have to be honest with you." He paused, not for effect, because he was searching for the right words, and Max Aldridge, who gave speeches and chaired meetings and navigated the language of power for a living, found that the right words were harder to locate than usual when they actually mattered. "I was a fool," he said finally. "Before tonight, before I saw you, before you even walked through that door, I had already decided how this was going to go. I had already written the story, and everything I had decided was wrong, and I'm sorry for it." Helen turned to look at him. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She let the words land where they needed to land, which told him she was someone who understood the difference between a silence that needs to be broken and a silence that needs to be honored. "What had you decided?" she asked. Quiet, steady, genuinely curious. Max held her gaze. "That you would be someone I would have to endure." He said it plainly, because she deserved plainness more than she deserved a polished version of the truth. That this would be an obligation and nothing more. I had convinced myself that anything arranged, anything chosen by my parents instead of by me, couldn't be real. He shook his head slightly. "I've never been more wrong about anything." Helen was quiet for a moment. The city hummed below them. Then she said, "I appreciate you telling me that." She looked back out at the lights. "I was nervous too. Not about who you would be. I decided before I came tonight to let you be whoever you actually were, and respond to that." She paused. "But nervous, because I didn't know if there would be anything real here. If it would just be two people being polite to each other forever." She glanced at him sideways. "It's not that." "No," Max agreed. "It's not that at all." And then something happened that neither of them decided to do. Their hands, resting a few inches apart on the balcony railing, moved together. Not dramatically, not in a sweeping cinematic gesture, just quietly, naturally, like two things that had always been meant to be adjacent, finally finding the correct position. Their fingers intertwined. Helen looked down at their joined hands for a moment, then back up at the sky. Max felt warmth travel from that point of contact through his entire body and reach, somehow, all the way to the part of him that had been cold and hollow for longer than he wanted to admit. They stood there for a while, not talking, not needing to. But I need you to understand something, and this is the part of the story where the tension comes back, where the warmth of that balcony is about to be tested by everything that exists beyond it. Because two people finding each other is a beautiful thing. But two people from different worlds, brought together by arrangement, surrounded by families with fears and agendas and old, deep assumptions about how life is supposed to work, that is not a story that resolves on a balcony. That is a story that is only just beginning to complicate itself. When Max and Helen came back inside, the room noticed. Not dramatically, no one gasped or pointed, but people noticed the way crowds always notice when something has shifted between two people. The proximity, the ease, the way they re-entered the space slightly different from how they had left it. And the two people who noticed most acutely were the two people who had arranged the entire evening. Aldridge watched her son guide Helen back to their table with a hand placed briefly at the small of her back, the most natural, unthought gesture in the world, which meant it was the most revealing one, and she felt something move through her that she quickly, efficiently suppressed. It was not happiness. It was not quite fear. It was the particular unease of someone who has engineered an outcome and realizes, midway through, that the outcome is engineering itself. Gregory Johnson, watching from across the room, saw his daughter settle back into her seat and lean in to say something to Max that made them both laugh. And Gregory felt the thing every father feels when he watches his child with someone new and good, a love so fierce and uncontrollable it almost looks like grief, the fear of losing her, the knowledge that if Max was what Gregory now suspected he was, Helen was already a little bit lost, and it was already a little bit wonderful. Marcia Johnson reached over and took Gregory's hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. And across the table, Charles Aldridge set down his drink and watched his son, really watched him for the first time all evening, and thought about Elaine 30 years ago, the party where they had met, the way he had felt, in the first hour of knowing her, that something enormous was happening, and he was powerless to stop it and didn't want to. He thought about his own father, who had told him that business and love were separate compartments, and the years it had taken him to understand that his father had been completely and entirely wrong. He cleared his throat quietly, said nothing, but the calculation in his eyes had changed. And here is where I leave you with the question that the rest of this story is going to answer. Because what you have just witnessed is a beginning, a real one, unexpected and unplanned, and more powerful for it. Two people who should not have found each other by any romantic logic, who were brought together by contracts and inheritance and family strategy, have discovered something in a single evening that some people search for across an entire lifetime. But discovery is not the same as certainty, and the families watching from the edges of that room are not finished yet. The assumptions that built this arrangement are not gone simply because two people held hands on a balcony. The world that Max and Helen are going to have to build together is full of tensions that one beautiful evening cannot resolve. Tensions about race, about wealth, about culture, about what a family is supposed to look like and who gets to decide. So here is the question I want you to carry with you. When two people find something real and rare and genuinely good, something that surprises even them, does the world around them rise to meet it? Or does it do what worlds so often do and push back? Because Max and Helen are about to find out, and the answer is going to demand more from both of them than one rehearsal dinner ever could. So here is the question that has been sitting quietly underneath everything you have just watched unfold. The question that neither Max nor Helen has said out loud, but that both of them feel pressing against the edges of every conversation, every shared glance, every moment of warmth they have discovered in each other across this extraordinary evening. Can something this unexpected actually last? Can two people who were brought together by contract rather than choice, by inheritance rather than instinct, by the careful calculations of families who were thinking about legacy and strategy rather than love, can they actually build something real, something durable? Something that holds not just in the golden light of a rehearsal dinner balcony, but in the honest, unromantic light of ordinary days? Because that is always the real test, isn't it? Not the moment of discovery. Not the first laugh, or the first honest conversation, or the first time two hands find each other on a railing above a glittering city. The real test is everything that comes after. The families, the history, the weight of two entirely different worlds deciding, slowly and imperfectly, whether they can share the same future. That is what Act 3 of this story is about, and I promise you, it is worth staying for. In the days that followed the rehearsal dinner, the Aldridge house was quieter than usual. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the held breath kind, the kind that settles over a household when something has happened that everyone is aware of and no one is quite ready to discuss directly. Max moved through the rooms with a lightness his parents hadn't seen in years, and that lightness, paradoxically, was what made the atmosphere so tense. Because Elaine and Charles Aldridge were people who understood control. They had built their entire world around it. And what they had witnessed at that rehearsal dinner was something that had moved entirely beyond their control, and done so effortlessly, naturally, without asking their permission. Max was happy. Genuinely, visibly, undeniably happy. And somehow that was the most complicated development of all. Elaine was the first to address it. She found Max in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, looking out the window at the garden with the expression of a man whose thoughts are somewhere warmer than Wisconsin in early spring. She sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table, which was a gesture Max had learned to read over a lifetime. It meant she was organizing herself before she spoke, choosing her words the way you choose tools for a precise job. "She's not what I expected," Elaine said. Max looked at her. "I know. I mean that in the most honest way I can manage right now." Elaine paused, looked at her coffee, then back at her son. "I had a picture in my mind of what this would look like, what she would be like. I was wrong. This was enormous." Max understood it as such, because Elaine Aldridge admitting she was wrong about something was not a casual event. It was not something that happened frequently or without cost. He recognized the effort it had taken her to form those words and release them, and he honored that by not rushing to fill the space after them. "She's extraordinary, Mum," he said simply. Elaine was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, with something in her voice that Max had not heard in a very long time, "I can see that." She reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over Max's. "I just need time to adjust to a future that looks different from the one I had drawn out." She squeezed once, withdrew her hand, stood up. "Give me time." "I will," Max said. And that was it. No grand declaration, no tearful reconciliation, just a mother and a son at a kitchen table, finding the first small step toward each other across a distance that had been quietly growing for years. Small steps are not dramatic, but small steps are how every important journey actually moves forward, and this one had just begun. Meanwhile, across the city, Helen's world was having its own reckoning. The Johnson household on the days after the rehearsal dinner was a different kind of alive from what it usually was. Still warm, still full of the sounds and rhythms of a family that knew how to be together, but charged with something new. Something that everyone in the house was circling around with curiosity and care. Helen's younger brother had 17 questions and the good sense to ask only 4 of them. Her aunt, who had come by on Wednesday with a pan of sweet potato pie and the thinly veiled intention of getting a full report, spent 3 hours at the kitchen table and left satisfied. And Marcia Johnson, warm, wise Marcia, who always knew what her daughter was feeling before Helen had fully felt it herself, watched her child in those days with the particular attention of a woman reading a book she has waited a long time to find. She saw it in the small things, the way Helen hummed while she was doing dishes, not absently, but specifically, as if there were a song playing somewhere in her head that had found its rhythm. The way she checked her phone and then set it down quickly with a specific expression, the expression of someone who has received a message that has made them privately glad. The way she sat at the piano on Thursday evening and played for almost an hour, moving through pieces she had loved for years with a feeling that seemed to go deeper than the notes. On Friday morning, Marcia sat down beside Helen on the porch, with 2 cups of tea and the unhurried patience of a woman who understands that some conversations cannot be rushed. They sat together for a while, watching the street wake up, a neighbor walking a dog, a mail truck turning the corner, the distant sound of children moving toward school. Then Marcia said quietly, "Tell me," and Helen, who had been holding it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you are not yet sure can bear the weight of words, exhaled, and said, "Mom, I think I love him." The sentence hung in the morning air between them. Helen looked at her mother with something between wonder and bewilderment, as if the words had surprised her as much as anyone. Marcia did not react immediately. She held her tea. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, in the way only mothers look, the way that takes in not just the face but the whole person, the whole history, all the mornings and evenings and years that have led to exactly this moment on exactly this porch. And then she smiled. Not the polite smile, not the reassuring, everything will be fine smile, the real one, the deep one, the one that said, "I see you, I believe you, I am not afraid for you." "Then don't hide it," Marcia said softly. "Don't be so careful with it that you forget to feel it." Helen's eyes filled. She nodded, and Marcia put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and they sat together in the quiet of a Friday morning, and the love between them, old, rooted, unshakable as the oak table in their kitchen, held everything gently, the way good love always does. Now, what about Gregory? Because Gregory Johnson was the variable in this equation that no one, not even Marcia, had fully solved yet. He was a man who had built his life on the foundation of discernment, on looking at a situation clearly, stripping away the surface, and asking the hard question underneath. What is this, really? It had served him well in business, in community, in every negotiation he had ever entered. It was the quality Helen had inherited most directly from him, and the quality he was now quietly, rigorously applying to the man his daughter was falling in love with. He had watched Max at the rehearsal dinner. He had noted what he noted. He had seen the listening, the respect, the lack of condescension. He had seen Max disagree with Helen and do it well, and he had seen Max receive disagreement from Helen and take it seriously, which was an even more important data point. He had seen a young man who was genuinely surprised by his own feelings, which meant the feelings were not performed. But Gregory Johnson had also grown up in America. He understood what it meant for his daughter to marry into a family of the Aldridges' particular background. He understood the specific, textured complexity of that, the history carried in it, the power dynamics embedded in it, the questions it would raise in their community, and the questions it would raise in his own heart on mornings when he was being completely honest with himself. He was not opposed. He was not afraid, but he was a father, and fathers ask the questions that love sometimes moves too fast to ask. He found Max on Saturday afternoon, not by arrangement, just the two of them, in the side garden of the Aldridge estate, where Gregory had stepped out for air and Max had been throwing a ball for Duke, who pursued it with the tireless enthusiasm of a creature entirely unburdened by the complications of human life. Gregory walked over. Max saw him coming, put the ball down, and stood up straight, not stiffly, but with the alertness of a man who recognizes that the next conversation matters. Gregory said, "Walk with me." They walked. The garden was large enough that they could move away from the house without feeling like they were retreating from it. The afternoon light was low and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it might otherwise. They walked in silence for a moment, the comfortable kind, which said something about both of them. Then Gregory spoke. "My daughter has never been ordinary," he said. "Not as a boast, as a fact, stated plainly by someone who has observed it his entire life. She has always known her own mind. She has always been clear about what she values. I did not raise her to be anyone's convenience." "No, sir," Max said quietly. "She is very clearly no one's convenience." Gregory glanced at him sideways. "What do you see when you look at her?" The question landed with weight. Max did not rush past it. He thought about it honestly, not about what answer would be strategic, not about what a father wanted to hear, but about what was true. He said, "I see someone who is more completely herself than anyone I have ever met. Someone who knows where she comes from and is proud of it and carries it forward without apology. Someone who is kind without being soft and direct without being unkind. Someone who made me laugh and made me think in the same conversation, and who called me on my own pretensions without even trying to. He paused. I see someone I don't want to disappoint. Gregory was quiet for a long moment. They walked. Duke found them and fell into step beside Gregory, who reached down and scratched the dog's ears without breaking his stride, which told Max something about Gregory Johnson that he filed away permanently. I'm going to ask you something, Gregory said, and I want the honest answer, not the right one. Yes, sir. Are you ready for what loving my daughter actually requires? Not the feeling of it, the work of it, because she comes with a history and a community and a set of values that don't bend for anyone's comfort, including yours. Max stopped walking. Gregory stopped too and turned to face him. And Max looked at Helen's father, this man who had built something from nothing, who had raised a daughter who walked into rooms and owned them without trying, who was standing in a garden, asking the most important question anyone had asked him in his 26 years on Earth. And he said, I know I don't fully understand yet what that requires. I think honesty demands that I say that. But I know that I want to learn, and I know that she is worth whatever learning costs. He held Gregory's gaze. I am not going to pretend I have it all figured out, but I am going to show up, every day. That I can promise. Gregory studied him for a long, slow moment, the kind of moment that has history in it. Then he extended his hand. Max took it, and Gregory Johnson shook his future son-in-law's hand with the firm, deliberate grip of a man who has made a decision and means it. Then you have my blessing, Gregory said. Don't make me regret giving it. I won't, Max said, and he meant it the way you only mean something when the weight of it has fully landed. They walked back toward the house. Duke ran ahead, already over it, already chasing something new. And somewhere in the kitchen, Marcia was making coffee, and Helen was at the piano, and the sound of it drifted out through the open window into the golden afternoon, something slow, something warm, something that sounded like the musical equivalent of a held breath finally releasing. Now we arrive at the eve of the wedding, and I want you to feel the shift that has happened across these days. Feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, in the quality of the air, in the way the light falls differently. The tension that had gripped the edges of this story, the family resistance, the old assumptions, the fear dressed up as practicality, has not disappeared. Tension that deep doesn't simply vanish, but it has transformed. It has moved from opposition into something more like awe. Both families, separately and together, have arrived at the same quiet realization. Something genuine is happening here. Something neither of them engineered, and neither of them could have predicted. And the only honest response to something genuine is to honor it. Elaine found Helen at the dressing room that evening, during the final rehearsal. She knocked, came in, sat down across from her future daughter-in-law with none of her usual armor, no public smile, no managed expression, no careful distance, just a woman, getting older, hoping she had not made too many permanent mistakes. She said, I want to apologize to you. Helen looked at her, steady and open. I came into this arrangement with a picture in my mind that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with what I thought I needed. That wasn't fair. You deserve to be seen clearly from the beginning. She paused. I see you clearly now, and I am grateful, genuinely grateful, that you are going to be part of our family. Helen looked at Elaine for a moment. Then she reached forward and covered Elaine's hand with both of hers. Thank you for saying that, she said. It means more than you know. And there, in a small dressing room on the eve of a wedding that had started as a contract, something that might eventually become a real relationship between two women took its very first step. Across the building, Charles Aldridge was doing something unusual for Charles Aldridge. He was sitting alone, in a quiet anteroom, with a glass of scotch he had barely touched, holding a photograph. It was old, the edges soft, the colors slightly faded in the way of photographs from 30 years ago. In it, a younger Charles stood beside a younger Elaine at what appeared to be a party. They were laughing at something off-camera. Elaine's hand was on his arm. They looked, in that photograph, like two people who had just discovered each other, and couldn't quite believe their luck. He heard a sound at the door and looked up. Max was standing there. Charles looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years without the overlay of expectation, without seeing the air instead of the person, and he said, "Come in, son." Max came in, sat down. Charles held out the photograph without speaking. Max took it and looked at it, looked at his parents, young and laughing, full of a future they couldn't yet see. Looked back up at his father, and Charles said quietly, "I forgot for a while what this is supposed to be about. I want you to know that I remember now." He picked up his scotch, held it up slightly. "To something real," he said. Max picked up the glass of water beside him. "To something real," he echoed. And they sat together in that quiet room, father and son, with 30 years of distance and one evening of honesty, and began the slow, imperfect, necessary work of finding their way back to each other. Sunday morning arrived the way the best mornings do, not with drama, but with light. Clear, generous, unhurried light that came through the church's stained glass windows and broke into colors across the stone floor, deep blue and amber, and a warm, quiet gold that settled over everything like a benediction. The church was full. Both families, side by side in the pews, the Aldridges in their tailored Sunday best, the Johnsons with the particular joyful elegance of people who know how to dress for a sacred occasion, filling the space with a low hum of anticipation that felt less like a society event and more like what it actually was, a community gathering to witness something true. The organ began, and the doors at the back of the church opened. Helen Johnson walked into the light. And I want to take a moment here, just a moment, to do justice to what that looked like. Because it was not simply a beautiful woman in a beautiful dress, though she was certainly that. The dress was ivory and flowing, catching the colored light from the windows as she moved, and her veil was delicate, and the white roses she carried were the same ones she had chosen at the florist's 2 weeks ago, the first independent decision she had made in this entire arrangement, and one that had told anyone paying attention exactly who she was. But what made the moment was not the dress or the flowers or the architecture of the morning. What made the moment was Helen herself, her posture, her steadiness, her face. She was not performing. She was not playing the role of bride. She was simply walking toward a man she had chosen to love, in a church full of people she cared about, carrying flowers she had picked herself, feeling every step of it completely and without pretense. Max saw her the moment the doors opened. He had been standing at the altar with his hands clasped, trying to look calm, which he was not. And then the doors opened, and Helen was there, and all the trying stopped. His face did something that faces only do when they are no longer being managed. It opened. Simply. Completely. Without reservation. Every wall down. Every calculation dissolved. Just a man, standing at an altar, looking at the person walking toward him, and feeling what he felt. He felt, for the first time in his life, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Helen reached the altar. She looked at Max, and Max looked at Helen, and the congregation seemed to hold its breath, that collective, involuntary hush that falls when a room full of people simultaneously recognizes something sacred. Gregory placed Helen's hand in Max's. His grip on her hand lingered for just 1 second longer than necessary, a father's last moment, brief and total, and then he released her, stepped back, sat down beside Marcia, who took his hand immediately, both of them already crying, neither of them trying to stop. The vows were not from a template. They had written them separately, privately, in the days between the rehearsal dinner and this morning, and they had not shared them with each other in advance, which meant what you heard at that altar was unfiltered, real. Max spoke first. His voice was steady, steadier than he expected, which told him something about where the words were coming from. He said, "I came into this arrangement expecting obligation. I told myself that what was arranged could not be real. I was wrong about almost everything. You walked into a room and showed me without trying that the heart does not care about the circumstances that brought you to it. It cares about what is true when you arrive. What is true, Helen, is that you are the best surprise of my life, and I promise to spend every day being worthy of that surprise." Helen listened to every word with her whole self. When he finished, She looked at him for a moment in the silence. Then she said, "I came into this with open hands and an open heart because my family taught me that love is not something you find already made. It is something you make together, every day, out of honesty and respect, and the willingness to keep showing up even when it is hard. You showed up, Max. That first night and every day since, you showed up honestly, and you showed up kindly, and you showed up as yourself, which is all I ever needed anyone to be." She paused. "I promise to be your home, the way my family has always been mine." The rings were exchanged, and when the officiant said the words that made it complete, when Max and Helen turned to face each other and he lifted her veil and she looked at him and they leaned toward each other for the first kiss of their married life, the congregation did not politely applaud. They erupted. Both sides of the aisle simultaneously without coordination, just the pure, spontaneous release of a room full of people who have been holding something in and can no longer contain it. Applause and laughter, and the particular sound of people crying while they're smiling, which is one of the most human sounds in existence. Elaine Aldridge pressed a handkerchief to her face with one hand and reached for Charles with the other. Charles took her hand and held it and didn't let go. Gregory Johnson threw his head back and laughed through tears, the laugh of a man who has been carrying a worry for weeks and has just set it down permanently. Marcia leaned into him and whispered something in his ear, and he nodded, and whatever she said was true. And Max and Helen turned to face the people who had brought them here, all of them, the complicated and the loving and the fearful and the proud, and they were smiling, both of them, fully, completely, without reservation. The lesson of this story is not complicated, but it's worth saying clearly because the best lessons usually are. Love does not always begin the way we planned. Sometimes it begins in spite of the plan. Sometimes the most genuine thing in your life arrives wearing the face of obligation and asks you to look past your assumptions and see what is actually standing in front of you. Max expected an arranged marriage and found the love of his life. Helen arrived with open hands and discovered a man worth opening them for. Their families came in with fears and found reasons to let them go. And everyone in that church walked out into Sunday sunlight a little more willing to believe that the unexpected is not always something to be afraid of. Sometimes it is the best thing that has ever happened to you. That is the whole story. And I want to know what it did to you. Because here is my question, and I am asking you directly, right now, to answer it in the comments below because your answer matters and I genuinely want to read it. Has something in your own life ever turned out completely different from what you feared, and in turning out differently, turned out better than anything you could have planned? A relationship, a decision, a door you almost didn't walk through. Tell me about it. Drop it in the comments right now, because this channel exists for stories, not just the ones I tell, but the ones you carry. And yours deserves to be heard. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, think something, remember something, share it with one person today. Just one. Someone who needs to be reminded that the best things in life rarely come announced, and that an open heart is the most powerful thing any of us will ever carry. We will see you in the next story, and I promise it is worth waiting for.